Hello, my name is Mark. And we are students of Ghana Christian International High School. And we urge you all to subscribe to His Girl TV. Link in bio.
Hello there. Hello, class. You are welcome to His Girl TV. In today's lesson, we will be learning about the coming of the Europeans to West Africa in the 15th century. But before that, let's look at our lesson objectives for today. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to list the European countries whose nationals had traded in West Africa by AD 1700. Also, you will be able to state the factors that motivated the Europeans to sail to West Africa by AD 1800. We would like to remind you to subscribe to our channel. Portugal was the first European nation to come to the African continent between 1419 and 1499. This occurred when two Portuguese explorers called Pedro de Escobar and João de Santarém reached Chamar in January 1471. Don Diego da Zambuja, another Portuguese explorer, led an expedition in December 1481, together with some Portuguese explorers and traders, to the shores of present-day Elmina. Because of Elmina's richness in gold, they named the place Elmina, meaning the mine. The traditional name of Elmina was called Edina. The English later called it the Gold Coast. Later on, the Portuguese built a castle at Elmina and called it São Jorge de Elmina in AD 1482. The Elmina castle became the main center of the Portuguese trade in West Africa. Kwame Ansa was the chief of Elmina. The Portuguese was followed by the Spaniards. However, the Spaniards left Africa after the discovery of the Americas. The English and the French also began to operate on the west coast from the last 2 decades of the 15th century. However, the activities of these two countries was not a threat to the Portuguese position in West Africa. The arrival of the Dutch from the 1590s posed a threat to the Portuguese position in West Africa. 20 years later, the Dutch had conquered all the Portuguese trading posts and castles on the west coast, including Elmina, and had established a monopoly over the West African trade. Other European countries that came to West Africa were the Danes in 1642, the Swedes in 1647, the Brandenburgers, now Germany, in 1682, also entered the West African coastal scene. The activities of the Swedes and the Brandenburgers were not successful, but the other 5 powers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the English, and the Danes continued to operate on the coast of West Africa until the Danes withdrew in 1850 and the Dutch in 1872. Now, let's take a look at the reasons for the coming of the Europeans to West Africa. The reasons for the coming of the Europeans have been categorized into 3 main groups. They were both economic, religious, and political factors that accounted for the coming of the Europeans to West Africa. Let's begin with the economic motives or factors. 1. The desire for trade with the West African people. 2. The search for a sea route to India and the Far East. 3. the need for large markets for their surplus produce. 4. The desire for slave labor. Let's look at the religious motives of the coming of the Europeans. 1. The desire to reduce the Muslim influence in West Africa. 2. The spread of Christianity. 3. To establish a link with Prester John in Coptic Egypt. Let's look at the political motives of the coming of the Europeans. Imperialist ambitions also accounted for the coming of the Europeans. Now let's take a look at some of the immediate effects of the coming of the Europeans on West Africa. 1. The coming of the Europeans led in the building of forts and castles along the coast of Africa. The immediate effect of the coming of the Europeans to Ghana was the construction of lodges, forts, and castles on the coast, stretching from Enzima in the west to Keita in the east. Examples of the castles were Cape Coast Castle, Elmina Castle, Christianborg Castle, Fort Williams at Anomabo, Fort Victoria at Cape Coast, Fort San Sebastian at Shama, and Fort Vernon at Pram Pram. These structures were meant to protect the inmates from attacks by their enemies, both black and white, and to serve as warehouses where their goods were safely kept. Another immediate effect of the coming of the Europeans was the rise of coastal towns. Another significant effect of the coming of the Europeans was the rise of coastal towns and inland market centers. For example, Cape Coast, Axim, Dixcove, Takrady, Sekendi, Shama, Great Commander, Elmina, Cape Coast, Anomabo, Kromante, Apam, Winneba, Accra, Pram Pram, Ada, and Keita all became very famous for the role they played. Some of these towns became market centers or seats of the British administration. Another effect for the coming of the Europeans was the growth of Western-style education. Formal education was introduced to the people of the Gold Coast. In 1529, the Portuguese set up a school in Elmina, but it was not successful. However, the Basel and the Wesleyan missions were the pioneers of primary education in Ghana. For example, the Wesleyan established the first secondary school in Ghana, known as Infanstipim School, in 1876. The last effect of the coming of the Europeans was the miscegenation or intermarriages between the African and the Europeans. The 15th century European contact with Africa also led to miscegenation or intermarriages between the white and local black women. The result was the coming into being of the half-caste known as mulattoes or Potoki, who were found scattered along the coast. By virtue of intermarriages, Ghanaians acquired European names, particularly Portuguese names such as Olympio, Pedro, Van der Poel, Da Costa, etc. Some European vocabularies were acquired and fused into Ghanaian languages. Words like pano, which is a Portuguese word for bread, asopatre, a Portuguese word for shoe, krata, a Portuguese word for paper, were adopted by the Akans. I believe that you have learned something from this short video. Try your hands on these past questions. Name any 3 countries whose nationals had traded in Ghana by AD 1700 or 1700. 2. State 4 factors that motivated the Europeans to sail to Ghana by AD 1800. If you like this video, kindly subscribe to our channel.